PowerPoint just crashed, so I'll reboot real quick. So Paulo sort of introduced a lot of the work, the kind of work that we're doing, and as he mentioned, I'm going to go into depth on something that we've sort of entitled Towards the Development of Multimodal Action-Based Assessment. So to set this up, he really, sort of outlined the environment that we work in, where kids are working on these kind of design and sort of building tasks. One of the things I want to touch on, though, is that you can probably see the reference in small white down there under. So we will use the sort of microgenetic analysis approach, or as Taylor mentioned yesterday, sort of nanogenetic analysis, where we will do these sort of in-depth studies on students and really capture high-frequency data about, in some cases, small collection of students. So the students, this population of students I'll be talking about right now, it's about, I think it's 13, 14, maybe 15 students, but from those students, we have very, very large streams of data. And I think this is one of the tools and one of our interests in learning analytics is to be able to capture and analyze that sort of high-frequency data without having to have a human sort of standing there and looking at it and trying to really analyze it. So, the building task. Again, Paulo sort of presented this. So we give the students this task of creating a structure that is as tall as possible, that can support about a 3-pound mass, and using basic household materials. So the materials that you're seeing here are sort of 5 popsicle sticks, 4 straws, a roll of tape, and a paper plate. And one of the other constraints is they can't tape this stuff to the table, because that would, sort of make it too easy. So we'll have these students complete this task, and again, it's students, high school students all the way up through PhD students in mechanical engineering, and we use that amount of experience that they've had in formal engineering as our proxy for their expertise. And as Paulo mentioned too, is we'll go through these codes and we'll code each of the students, or each one of the students' actions. And from those, and actually, let me give you guys a couple of quick examples of what these actions look like so they make a little bit more sense. So here you're seeing a breaking action. So the student just took the popsicle stick apart, and we'll break it up. Here we're going to see, this is planning or prototyping. So he's not actually building with this right now, but what he was actually doing is just sort of putting the pieces together and kind of simulating what would happen. Another example down here. This is going to be a really fast example of an undo. So he kind of puts this tape on there, and there's let me switch that around. And there's other examples too where students do sort of larger kind of undo actions where they'll take everything apart. And then lastly, this is a combination of the student's going to make a small adjustment, and then go into testing the system. So he's adjusting it now, sort of fiddling around with it, and then goes into testing. So we'll take these sequences of actions. And actually, let me give you, so you guys can put it all together. Here's just a really fast video of how a student goes from start to finish. Again, just to give you a picture of kind of what happens there. And there you go. That's exactly how it happens, right? So we'll take these structures or take these videos from these students. And here's just a quick example of this was an expert from one of the mechanical engineering students, and here's a novice. And ultimately what we do is we will identify very basic statistics about them to start off with. First, we can kind of look at how much time did each student spend building. So looking at the literature, there's work that is suggested that students that can do tasks faster are more experienced, right? They end up being more expert. But part of the thing is that within this context, that sort of lens, or that way of looking at it, doesn't quite work. And one of the reasons is that when you have this goal of trying to optimize and really build the best structure possible, you end up having an expert saying, okay, I got something that kind of works, but they continue to work on and on and on until they can really get to that highest level. So just looking at this very simple data point of how long did they spend didn't quite get at the kind of analysis that we wanted to do. And then again, you can also think about, well, we have this sequence of all the actions that they took. And Paulo showed this earlier, where you can look at the most frequent kind of actions that students may have been taking. And I mean, we do see some trends here. We do see some trends towards the less experienced students on the bottom doing, you know, on average more adjusting than what the other students are doing. But in fact, when we try to use this data to build a classifier, which one we have issues with doing just from the onset because we have such a small data set. But when you try to build a classifier from these things, that's a sort of non-process oriented classification, it doesn't necessarily do all that well. It does okay. But I show this slide here because I want to indicate that the approach that we end up using does significantly better. But even in saying that, the goal of what I'm presenting right now and present to you guys today is not to say that we have solved a technique for saying that we can be able to predict levels of expertise based on building actions. Because we're using such a small population of students, the goal here is really to motivate more of a technique or motivate more of a method and really motivate more kinds of work that's going to happen in this space. So I just want to set that up as the context of some of what I'm talking about. So what did we do? What did we do to get this, you know, this sort of improved result? And really, we appealed to process. We appealed to studying the student, or analyzing the process that students took. Now, the first thing was, though, you guys probably remember that slide I showed you earlier with all the different possible actions students could take was much larger than this. So the very first thing that we did when we analyzed this data is we then broke down those initial classes that we started with and actually combined them into much more generalizable classes. So we have a planning or building stage that really are a building class that encompasses building and breaking. We have a very large sort of planning kind of class, and then a class around testing and a class around adjusting and undoing. Part of this is nice because by going to this level of compression, or really going to looking at these kinds of classes of actions, when we try to then go and use either computer vision or machine learning to try to predict the kinds of action students are taking based on how they're moving object around and based on the gestures that we're taking, we're now trying to classify things into just 5 classes as opposed to trying to put them into 14 different classes. But nonetheless, for this analysis, it was all hand-coded. So to give you a sense of what that looks like, we started off with something like this, where we'll have timestamps on when each action started. We'll then take those values and convert them into and put them into the actual class structure that they have, or into the class that we associated with them with. And then the next thing that we do is we will take the sequence and we'll segment the sequence based on every testing action that the student takes. And here the reason why we're segmenting based on testing action is because we kind of see that as a unit of work. When the student has completed several actions and then decides to go test, to us that sort of indicates that they're expecting a certain result from their actions. They've completed a set of actions and they are anticipating that what they have done is going to lead to some sort of outcome, lead to something noticeable in how the structure is going to stand up. So we will segment them based on the testing, and then after that we will look at each segment and we will look at the proportion of time, or look at the portion of time devoted within that segment to the 5 different actions. So the 5 different action classes being adjusting, building, planning, testing, and undoing. And we take this data for all the students. So we have probably about 300 different segments when we go across all the students, and we'll take those segments and we'll cluster them to try to identify, in some sense, generalizable action segments that students take. And that's what's represented here. So in this graph, we're seeing the 10 clusters, and just to walk through some of these. So this first cluster, it's tiny, and this actually just represents testing. So this line, this gray line right here, represents 0. So here we're seeing that this is above, so testing is really the only above average kind of action that happened within this cluster. And then within this cluster, all the other stuff happened at below average rates. So what we see then is we have about 5 or 6 clusters that are predominantly undoing behavior, but you're seeing it's undoing in the context of different kinds of actions. So here it really is just, this bottom one is really just undoing. Up here you have a state of a student doing undoing combined with some building action. Here it's undoing combined with largely adjusting action. And then here it's a whole lot of undoing combined with a little bit of adjusting action. And then we have a couple of other states here that have a lot more red in them that are different combinations of building, planning, and adjusting. So once we have these 10 clusters, we will go back and relabel the segments. So I showed you guys an example beforehand, had 4 segments on there, and it had the breakdown, the proportion of each of the 5 action classes, and how much of those each of those action classes filled each one of these segments. But we'll replace each one of those segments now with cluster labels that we came up with from the k-means clustering. And what we get then is a way for looking at how students vary or how they're different in terms of the way that they transition between the different states or transition between the different clusters. So here I'm showing the transition probability table for a novice. Now, you don't have to try to memorize all these numbers. Really what I'm going to show, the next slide is going to be for an expert. And what we're going to see is that it's really how students transition into these states of 5, 6, and 9 that is different between the experts and the novices. And again, I'm going to break this down so you can make more sense of this, because otherwise it's just a ton of numbers. So 5, 6, and 9 then, to recap, are these guys. So here we're seeing in 5 that this is really undo with some adjusting. 9 is undo with some building, and here we're mostly in a sort of planning and building state. So what we're seeing is that using this approach, we are looking at the differences, and again, in how students are going to transition into these different modes. So here is kind of a representation of a novice. So for a novice, they ended up having sort of 3 different ways, or 3 different states from which they transition into state 5, which I called adjusting and undoing. So they can get there from a previous segment they were largely adjusting, a previous segment where they're largely undoing, or a previous segment where they're largely testing. For the expert, they really only get to this adjust and undo state from a previous state of adjusting. And that is one of the examples of, I think, how this approach and this sort of algorithm was able to come up with the level of accuracy and precision that it did. So here we're kind of seeing that it does a pretty good job of identifying experts, and then recall ends up, being all right for people of high and people of low expertise. In the paper, I also talk about how we will actually analyze the gesture data. So we got the data from the Kinect sensor, and we started noticing this. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing the left hand and right hand action, so the cumulative amount of action that's happening for a novice. Here you're seeing the cumulative amount of action that's happening for experts. And we started noticing this trend in the data, and then once again we did quick clustering, and based on this we're also able to do a fairly good job of differentiating between experts and novices. And this is actually related to some previous literature in neuroscience, where they will suggest that by incorporating both your left hand and right hand, you are working both sides of the brain. And there's research that will sort of say that using one side of the brain is typically associated with coming up with ideas, and the other side of the brain is associated with being able to differentiate between ideas. And that potentially one thing could be happening is we're seeing that sort of evidence here. but we're not really trying to suggest any sort of causality, or not saying that we have it all figured out, but just that there seems to be interesting information embedded within the gestures that students are taking. But I kind of want to take a moment and move beyond expertise. So we had these labels of how students were experts, and I mean, I think that is one way of looking at what was going on, but in many respects, I think we want to move beyond that and really look more at just the similarities in the processes that students are taking. Now, when I do that, though, and try to map it back to my levels of expertise, and in this case, so what I did that was different was, instead of creating 10 clusters, 10 generalizable clusters, I ended up creating 4 generalizable clusters, for which the silhouette values were better. But when I do that, I get really bad results in terms of expertise. Now, if my goal was to be able to predict expertise, this would be a problem. And it would kind of be, there would be this disconnect of, well, my silhouette value says that these are the kinds of clusters, this is the right size, or this is the right number of clusters to be using, but it's not working very well in terms of expertise. So if expertise is my metric, and if expertise is my goal, then I'd probably scrap this whole approach and say, this was a waste of time. But what you actually start to get at when you do this, when you do it with this small number of clusters, is that you start to pick up on actual approaches that students took. And I'll try to explain that a little bit more. So here is an example of, again, the transition probabilities for one of the clusters that I got. Now, interestingly, that this cluster consisted only of experts and of novices. And the thing that really distinguished this cluster is that these students seem to go between building and planning more so than the other clusters. And here's just a comparison of looking at the statistical significance in how students transition across the 4 clusters that end up breaking them down into. So when you compare this is the student clusters, not the state clusters. When you compare this cluster, so cluster 0 is the cluster I told you about that has both experts and novices, to one of the other clusters, so cluster 1, that actually has primarily individuals of medium expertise. These students, the way that they transition into planning is much different. And then when you look, compared to other clusters, you're seeing that the way they transition into building and they transition into texting and adjusting is different. But so we are actually picking up substantive differences in the actual approaches that students are using. Well, one of the interesting things, though, is I told you that this cluster consisted of both experts and novices. So we had experts and novices, in a sense, following the same process of interspersing planning with testing. But what this clip here is going to sort of describe is one of the experts' approaches.
I thought that I was going to make this my base, and then when I realized I had extra materials left over, I decided to try and add more height underneath it. So that was unexpected. I thought I was going to just have this be the base plus struts coming up.
So that was an explanation from one of our experts on how they approach the problem. They had a sense of what they were going to do at the onset, but then they go into more of this sort of tinkering mode. When we compared this to the approach that the novices took, and let me back up and I'll say that, so what she was really saying is that she planned, but then she said, to make this thing taller, I realized I could make it taller, and that's what sort of influenced the approach that she took, was this goal of making it taller. The novices who used a similar approach, they were really more working around this goal of just making the structure itself stand. So you get into this different question around students using a similar process or similar approach, but doing it with different types of intentionality. And I think that's part of what we want to get at with the multimodal aspect of this, is that we can look at the actions, but if we only look at actions and don't actually look at intentions or look at some of the other data that we can start to collect around students, that we may oversimplify things. We may miss the point, and we may still be using process-oriented data, which is really good, but end up, again, well, missing really some of the nuances that take place. So in future work, we're looking at actually sort of automating this process of tracking objects around, and I'll skip showing the video for this. But using computer vision, so we have the camera over top to capture the objects So then using computer vision to study how those are moving around. Doing more in terms of gesture tracking. What we did here with two-handed action was fairly basic, and we really want to do more with the gestures. So in actually combining gestures and the object tracking to be able to predict actions. We're also incorporating stuff around galvanic skin response, around the facial action coding system, and around looking at prosody when students are talking about what they're doing. So in summary, and these are all sort of mentioned in the paper, one neat thing about it is that students actually enjoyed what they were doing. They didn't actually feel like they were going through an assessment, and they were doing something that was actually very authentic to the types of activities that they were doing within the class itself. We were able to segment the data using sort of theoretically grounded approach on recognizing the unit of work. And if we didn't do this, and I can tell you this because, well, I tried it, if we didn't do this, we ended up seeing nothing. We ended up sort of seeing just kind of noise. And then lastly, we were sort of able to see that when we looked at more process-oriented measures over static measures, we're able to come up with better results. So yeah, the goal of this was really sort of motivate more work around studying building and really using multimodality as a way of trying to assess process and assess things that are going on within the actual practice of learning. Thank you.
Gregory Dyke, University of Lyon. I was wondering, we've seen some work, in some work that we did with much younger kids, we saw that they kind of get stuck with one idea and don't undo enough. And I was also thinking that's kind of similar to what some of the stuff that Taylor presented on Wednesday, where again, the first step that you take is kind of determinant in whether you're going to succeed or fail. And so I was wondering, do experts take good first steps the first time, or do they undo their first steps? And do novices tend to not undo their first steps and have just no hope of really doing well, or how does that work out?
So I will say, for one, in this context, we actually had a range of individuals from novices all the way up to experts that didn't successfully do the task. So there is, especially one of our experts tried, they couldn't get it done. But I think it is true that there may not be that much undoing that's going on. Undoing sometimes doesn't seem natural to a number of the students, but I don't think it's always ends up being to their detriment. I don't think there were students that because they didn't want to undo what they did, they ended up not being able to complete the task.
Nice presentation. So you have all this data from labeled experts and novices, and you can observe the patterns of behavior and the changes in clustering of those novices and those experts. What can you speculate on how interventions might be designed based on the information that you've collected?
So we've done a few kind of studies around looking at, in a sense, students getting stuck in certain types of states, students getting stuck in certain types of modes. And I think that is potentially one area where we can try to offer intervention. So if a student seems like they're getting stuck in a state, to perhaps introduce them to a mechanism, or perhaps introduce them to a real-world structure. So one of the ways that the novices were able to approach doing this task, and the ones that I think were really successful, they were able to say, oh, I can make this like a table. Or, oh, I can make this like a chair. And once they have some way of grounding it in some sort of real-world object that they know about, that ends up giving them some direction in what they're doing. So, I mean, I think that's one way, is if you see students that seem to be constantly struggling, help them to be able to reframe it and kind of say, well, let's think about what kind of real-world structure you can think about in this context, and let them hopefully use that as a vehicle or as a way of sort of focusing their thinking or kind of redirecting their thinking to stuff that they may already be aware of, but they just may not recognize as applicable to the situation that they're dealing with.
So next up, we have